right along, I want to talk for a second about call to write. You're going to hear this term a lot, the author's call to write. Your research paper is going to be about the story that you choose to write about, the author's life, and his or her call to write. So the call to write is what's going on in and around the author when they create a particular text. That call to write can be personal, as it was with Poe. It can be social or cultural. We're going to see some examples of that in later on this week. It can be political or historical. We will see examples of that as well. The point is that no author writes in a vacuum. Things are going on in and around the author, and that helps to create the text that we write. So, for example, we're in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic. In the next couple of years, we are going to see books about what's happening right now. In fact, I'm already thinking about fall semester and how I might have my Comp 1 students write pandemic narratives. So the world that we live in helps to frame and helps to create the text that we write, and the same is true for these authors. So let's talk a little bit about Poe's call to write. First things first, let's talk about Poe and Rufus Griswold. I may have mentioned this before when we did the Haunted Palace, but Poe was not really appreciated in his time. He was published, but he really didn't make a living on his fiction. In fact, he made most of his money writing reviews of other authors' works, and those reviews could be scathing, I mean horrible. And those authors often hated him. So Poe was really known for the conflicts he was constantly getting involved in. So the same is true for Rufus Griswold. Poe reviewed some of Griswold's work, and he was excessively cruel um, about Griswold's writing. And Griswold was the same. He would review Poe's work, and he would be scathing in turn. And then when Poe died, Rufus Griswold writes this biography about Poe, and this biography is vicious. He basically calls Poe a lousy writer, an alcoholic, an opium addict, basically the worst kind of humanity, etc. And ironically, what happens is that people become kind of interested. They're like, wow, this guy just died. This guy Poe just died. And there's this other guy, Griswold, who is basically, dancing on his grave. And what could Poe possibly have done to deserve this kind of reaction? And so they actually become interested in Poe's work and they start reading him. And that is why we read Poe's work today. The other supplemental text I asked you to read was the one on Poe and Thomas Dunn English. So once again, Poe and Thomas Dunn English were in this sort of battle of reviews. Dunn English would review Poe's stuff, Poe would review English's stuff, and they both would write nasty things about the other. Now, there is some evidence that Thomas Dunn English actually wrote a novel, and one of his characters was sort of a character who was meant to be Poe and sort of make fun of Poe. And so some people argue that the Cask of Amontillado is really a story about Poe wanting revenge on either Thomas Dunn English or Rufus Griswold. So where do we see evidence of the author possibly working to enact revenge on Thomas Dunn English or Rufus Griswold or both of these men? Primarily, we see this in the characterization of Fortunato. Fortunato is dressed as a court jester. So take a look at your copy of the story. Look at paragraph 4. The man wore motley. He had on a tight-fitting party-striped dress, and his head was surmounted by the conical cap and bells. So he's described as one who is wearing the costume of the court jester. Another word for a jester is fool. And so the fool's job in the king's court was to sometimes hurt himself or poke fun at himself in an effort to get a laugh out of the king and his courtiers. So, from the very beginning, from the very first description of Fortunato, the author seems to be poking fun at this character. Another way that we see the author poking fun at this character is in his description of Fortunato's pride. So, in paragraph 2, it reads, "He had a weak point, this Fortunato. Although in other regards he was a man to be respected and even feared, he prided himself on his connoisseurship of wine." So he's made fun of because of his excessive pride. Remember, it's his pride that encourages Fortunato to follow Montresor into the catacombs in the first place. Montresor says, "Hey, I'll just ask Lucchesi." And Montresor says, or rather, Fortunato says, "You can't ask Lucchesi. Lucchesi's an idiot. I'm the expert." And so that is what sort of encourages him to go down those steps. So Poe, the author, seems to be making fun of this character, Fortunato, by dressing him as a fool and by poking fun at what he sees as the character's excessive pride. The other way that we see Poe making fun of this character Fortunato, who may in fact be a characterization of Thomas Dunn English or Rufus Griswold, is in his use of humor throughout the story. So if you didn't notice it the first time, Poe is actually really funny. Here we are at the bottom of page 2 of the copy I provided. This is actually paragraph 24. And it reads, "There were no attendants at home. They had absconded, they had left, to make merry in honor of the time." So they'd gone off to party during the carnival. "I had told them that I should not return until morning, and had given them explicit orders not to stir from the house. These orders were sufficient, I well knew, to ensure their immediate disappearance, one and all, as soon as my back was turned." So basically, what Montresor, the narrator, is saying here is he told his servants not to leave. He absolutely forbade them to leave, and he knew that this is what would, in fact, encourage them to leave and give him the house all to himself so he could commit this murderous act. So this is his first joke. The next joke that the narrator and Poe seem to be making at Fortunato's expense comes at the bottom of page 2 and on the top of page 3. So there's this point in the story where Fortunato starts to cough, and you can see that here with this cursor here in front of you. And Montresor says, "Hey, let's go back. I don't want to be responsible for your health." And at one point, Fortunato gets frustrated. He's like, "Enough. The cough is a mere nothing. It will not kill me. I shall not die of a cough." And then here at the top of page 3, Montresor goes, "True, true." So he's saying, "Yes, that's true. You won't die of a cough because I'm going to kill you." And that's the joke here. A little while later on page 3, in that first column on page 3, Montresor takes a bottle of wine and he opens it, and they each take a drink and they toast each other. And Fortunato drinks to all of the dead who are buried around them. And Montresor says, "And I drink to your long life." Again, this is Montresor, the narrator, who may in fact be Poe himself, Poe sort of writing himself into the story. This is Montresor making fun of Fortunato because he knows he's not going to have a long life because he plans on killing him in just a couple of minutes. One of the last jokes in the story happens in the second column on page 3. At one point, Fortunato makes this gesture, this hand gesture, and Poe doesn't get it. Or rather, I'm sorry, Montresor doesn't get it. The narrator doesn't get it. And Fortunato says, "Well, you must not be a Mason." And Montresor says, "Oh, sure, I'm a Mason." And Fortunato replies, "Well, if you're a Mason, prove it." And so Montresor reaches into his cloak and he takes out a trowel, right? Basically a tool that one uses to lay brick and mortar. It's basically the murder weapon that Montresor is going to use to kill Fortunato, and he shows it to him before he kills him. And again, like if it were a knife or a gun, it might have shocked Fortunato, but Fortunato thinks, "Oh, he's just making a joke," and kind of rolls his eyes and laughs it off. And the reader, especially if this is like the second or third time you're reading it, it's like, "Oh my God, how stupid really can you be not to get this?" The last thing I want to talk about in regards to this story is the author's use of second person. At the very beginning, in the very first paragraph, he tells the reader that he wants to enact revenge, and then he switches to second person for just a sentence or so. He says, "You who so well know the nature of my soul will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. So he talks to the reader, this you. We know that the murder happened 50 years ago, and it's been 50 years since he murdered Fortunato and got away with this crime. One could assume that he was probably in his 30s, his early 30s, when he committed the murder. So he's probably, somewhere in his 80s now. So you could imagine somebody on their deathbed talking to somebody about what, basically making confession. And notice the language he uses here, you who so well know the nature of my soul. So that implies a very close relationship, husband and wife, maybe like a grandparent talking to a grandchild. And I think this is kind of interesting. I think what Poe is trying to do here is to get you to think about who you know and how well you know the people you think you know. So imagine, sitting at your grandfather's bedside and they're maybe living through the last few days, last few weeks of their life, and they're like, sit down, let me tell you a story. And so you think that you know people, you think you know your friends, your family, you know them so well. And I think what Poe is trying to say here is you really don't, right? You really don't know all of the secrets of all of the people that you know. And I think that is actually one of the most horrific parts of this particular story.